Shaken baby syndrome and how these tragic cases are prosecuted. A group representing 1,800 pediatricians has banded together to call on Governor Charlie Baker to launch a review of the state medical examiner's office. More specifically, they want to know how that office determines whether a child died from this kind of abuse. Many of us were first introduced to the idea of shaken baby syndrome back in 1997 during the trial of Louise Woodward. The 18-year-old British au pair was charged with second-degree murder in the death of 8-year-old Matthew Eapen. She was convicted, but the charge was later reduced to involuntary manslaughter. But since that trial, a lot of questions have been raised about the science behind shaken baby diagnosis. And just this past year, the medical examiner changed homicide rulings in 3 different cases of child deaths. In 2 of those cases, prosecutors dropped murder charges. Joined now by former Attorney General Martha Coakley, who prosecuted the Louise Woodward case. Good to see you, Martha. And Defense Attorney Jada Carney, who's represented 2 of the 3 people charged in those most recent cases, one of which is still moving forward. Jay, it's good to see you, too. Thanks for coming. Yeah. So 3 shaken baby cases, Martha, in recent times. A medical examiner reversed himself. I said 2 charges dropped, 1 not. We'll talk about that in a minute. Is this not evidence that the medical examiner and prosecutors are too fast to jump on this shaken baby syndrome thing to prosecute people?
No, absolutely not. I think what it's evidence of is that in the last 20 years, when the science around this has been evolving, and when new prosecutors have come in, doctors who aren't as aware of this, and medical examiners who aren't trained in what they need to know to identify the symptoms and the syndrome of shaken baby are just not doing their job. And so there's 1,800 pediatricians who said, we need to see what the medical examiner's office is doing. There's 15 to 20 people around the country. And I respect Jay. He's one of the best defense lawyers here. His job is to create a reasonable doubt. But the medical examiner's job is to find out why kids die.
Yeah, but the doctor, this Dr. Alice Newton, and 2 of the, how long was Jeff Wilson in jail, your client, Jeffrey Wilson, in jail?
About 6 months.
6 months. Aisling Brady McCarthy in jail for 2 years. This celebrated pediatrician from MGH was the doctor on whose expert opinion the prosecutor relied, and she was wrong in both cases.
No, I disagree. I think Dr. Newton was right. I think the medical examiner was wrong.
When the medical examiner reversed the conclusion?
Yes, in both instances, I think the medical examiner is wrong. And in this instance, the most recent one, the medical examiner had left the office when she reversed her opinion. Now, this case,
is the Burlington case where the charges have not been dropped, your latest
and the DA is still going forward on it. But the question is the medical examiner's office.
Is your position, I've read a lot about this, Jay, in the last couple of days, is your position that this diagnosis is fake to begin with, or that in some cases prosecutors and medical examiners are overeager? Where are you?
I don't say that the diagnosis is fake. I just say that the science is catching up to the medicine. The theory of shaken baby is that an infant is held by an adult and shaken back and forth in this manner, thus dislodging the brain and causing massive bleeding on the brain, and it leads to the child's death. Well, science, biomechanical engineers have proven a human being, even a football player, cannot generate the amount of force with the head going back and forth to cause this type of injury.
So what do you think? So you don't agree with this syndrome? And based upon what you just said about the science being faulty there, then is there ever a case in which this is an appropriate basis for prosecution?
It's very significant that recently the medical community has stopped calling it shaken baby syndrome. They now call it abusive head trauma, because what the science shows is that in order for the child to suffer traumatic brain injury being shaken, the head at some point has to come in contact with something so that the head stops suddenly. That's what dislodges the brain.
That's exactly the point, Jay. But that has been true since I did these cases back in the late 90s. It's better to call it shaken impact or abusive head trauma because it's shaking and slamming. It's impact. You see the fractured skull, you see the brain damage, and you see the retinal bleeding. And yes, there are some syndromes that mimic it, but the ME's job is to weed that out.
But Martha, don't you worry? I mean, the conviction rate I read is on shaken baby cases, 89% higher nationally, much higher than in violent crimes in general. Even, what's the name of the guy? Dr. Barnes, who was your lead expert witness in the Woodward case, even he says if he got to testify again, he wouldn't have said what he said about little baby Matthew Eapen.
Look, Dr. Barnes is now part of these 15 to 20 people who've made a cottage industry out of attacking these diagnoses. Let them do it, but it's not.
But when he testified for you, he was legit, and now he's...
He was a consultant who actually hadn't seen Matthew Eapen.
Okay.
And so whatever made him change his opinion on this, but kids don't die for no reason. And it's important, shouldn't we wonder why these babies died? And there's a difference between knowing why they died and how they died, and whether a prosecutor can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's Jay's job to raise that.
But that's what I worry about. Most people don't get to hire him. What happens to people who may have been charged and convicted in a shaken baby syndrome case who are not lucky enough, I'm serious, to have a top-notch lawyer enter one of these 89% convictions? I mean, I'm assuming we don't know what the number is. There are a decent number who are as innocent as Jeffrey Wilson and Aisling Brady McCarthy who just haven't been discovered. You don't agree with that?
I don't agree with that.
How can you not agree with that?
How can you? How can you say
if he hadn't represented these people, they'd probably still be rotting in jail?
And he was...
One of them, Wilson, and the current case.
But he was a good enough attorney to raise questions with a medical examiner's office that doesn't have the training to make the right conclusion.
So what's your solution? You're shaking your head. Go ahead.
You don't go to a heart surgeon if you want a diagnosis about a foot injury.
What does that mean?
That means you don't go to a pediatrician to determine the cause of death of an infant.
Who should you go to?
A pediatrician simply takes care of children who are alive. A medical examiner is a pathologist. He or she has had advanced training to determine what is the manner and cause of death. That's what they do. They're the specialists in the field. I find it very curious that the pediatricians, now that this so-called shaken baby syndrome is being discounted across the country, and people are being let out of prison every week based on a false conviction on shaken baby syndrome, we should leave it up to the medical examiners. They're the ones who make the determination.
The pediatricians are the ones who see all of these kids who come into a hospital with the injuries. They know when injuries are accidental, when they're congenital, and when they are inflicted. And in the Matthew Eapen case, that baby, as many of them are on life support, they're in hospitals, and doctors are able to look at those injuries and diagnose them, and they have a lot more experience with that than medical examiners who don't necessarily see them.
And by the way, in all fairness, in this Jeffrey Wilson case, the thing that you ultimately got him off on, no one even knew that this condition existed in the family, not the medical examiner, not the parents themselves. So it was nobody's fault. There was not malfeasance on anybody's part. Ultimately, you discovered something that cleared this person.
And that's his job, to create a reasonable doubt.
Why is this Pahlavi, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. What's her name?
Machala.
Why is she still, of these two, the Wilson case, the McCarthy case, the prosecutor, Ryan, decided to drop these cases. Why not here?
Well, it's a difficult decision to drop a murder charge against someone. And in this case, another pathologist in the office, Harry Niels, has said he's going to support the original diagnosis. And so I have the former chief medical examiner of Rhode Island who reached a conclusion. The doctor who actually did the autopsy reached the identical conclusion after looking at the case more deeply.
Final word, Martha Coakley.
She determined it was cause of death, and she left the office and now works with Dr. Patrick Lanz, who's one of these 15, 20 people. There's a huge conflict of interest in that changed opinion, and I'm glad that DA Ryan is going to prosecute the case.
15 seconds to respond to that, please.
Let the people who are trained to determine the cause of death make the decision.
Martha Coakley, nice to see you.
Good to see you as always, Jim.
Pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you. See you soon.